The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to Urban Fantasies, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to all of you in Paranormal Radio Land. Time for another foray into the world of weird tales, ghosts, folklore, urban myths and magic. I'm Charles Christian and with me is Janie. Let's start with a few notable dates, anniversaries and occurrences.
We begin with a ghostly manifestation, not of a person, but of a thing, an airplane. There are recurrent sightings of a World War II Spitfire being seen over the skies of Biggin Hill Airport, which is in Kent. January is its favourite haunting month, with January the 19th being the date on which it's most frequently seen. Cue Jason with your sound effects.
Another memorable date in the Hauntology calendar for this month is the 25th of January, for it was on this day in 1533 that Anne Boleyn married King Henry VIII.
Bit of advice, Anne. Don't do it, love. It'll all end in tears.
Having lost her heart to Henry, Anne went on to lose her head just over 3 years later when she was beheaded in May 1536. Despite, however, her relatively short career as a Queen of England, in her afterlife she went on to become one of this country's most popular ghosts, well, at least most frequently seen ghosts, and is still reputed to haunt the Tower of London, Hever Castle, Windsor Castle, Hampton Court, Rochford Hall, and, up here in Norfolk, Blickling Hall, where she was born. The Blickling Hall ghost is particularly over the top for haunting, as legend has it that every year, on the anniversary of her execution, a black coach, driven by a headless coachman and pulled by 4 black headless horses, drives up to the gates of the hall. Anne is sat inside, with her head on her lap.
Ooh. Well, I just say I've never quite got this headless coachman and horses thing, because how does the coachman know where he's going, number one? And as for the horses, you know, all their traces and the harness and bits and things, they'd just fall on the floor, surely.
Yes,
Just thought.
I'd have thought so. It gets worse, though, because Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, on that same night, because he did nothing to stop King Henry from having both Anne and her brother executed. In fact, Thomas, who was a bit of a social climber, actually sat on the jury that convicted his own son, and, as a result, this also made Anne's conviction unavoidable. He is cursed to be driven by this same combination of headless coachmen and headless horses. I'm not sure whether it's the same headless coachman and the same headless horses or a change, across 12 of Norfolk's bridges between midnight and cockscrow in the morning. If he completes the task within the allotted time limits, the curse will be lifted and he'll go to heaven. If he doesn't, he remains trapped in limbo.
Well, given the traffic and slow roads in Norfolk, frankly, he's doomed for all eternity. However, to end on a contemporary note, we have a report from the 24th of November 2017, that's less than 2 months ago, of a UFO sighting in the UK. And apparently it was a large triangular craft that moved irregularly across the sky, as they always do. It made no sound and would occasionally disappear and then reappear. And the location was Isted Rise in Kent, which is a few miles south of Gravesend.
Weather balloon then.
Yeah. So are we done with dates and anniversaries?
Not quite, because we also need to talk about the folklore and legends surrounding St Agnes Eve, which is the 20th of January.
Ah, I remember reading that. How does the poem go? It was by Yeats, wasn't it? St Agnes Eve, ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Bit like the temperature in the studio tonight, frankly. You crank it up a bit, it's freezing.
Yeah, you just need to say it was actually by Keats, not Yeats. Only 100 years out.
I'll do it again. Keats.
Keats.
What did I say?
Yeats.
Yeats. I was thinking of wine bar.
You were. It's not wine o'clock for another 10 minutes.
Oh dear. Should we one time just try it? Do this in the morning. Okay. Where am I going? Oh,
I remember.
I remember reading that. How does the poem go by Keats? It's something like this. St Agnes Eve, ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold.
Keats based his poem on an old folklore tradition that St Agnes Eve is one of the traditional times of the year for love divination rituals, which is when young women would try to discover if they were going to be married over the next 12 months and who their husbands might be.
Ah, because young women in the 19th century didn't get out much, and they didn't have access to Facebook, of course. Though I do recall reading that along with St Agnes Eve, other popular dates for conducting love divination were St Valentine's Day, well, obviously, May Eve, Midsummer's Eve, St Anne's Eve, that's 26th of July, in case you were wondering, put it in the diary, Halloween and New Year's Eve. And not forgetting weddings, which had their own rituals, including catching the bride's bouquet, which we all know about, and sleeping with a piece of wedding cake beneath your pillow. So what form did these rituals take?
There were a couple, although it's worth noting that Keats rather sexed up the version in his poem by having his heroine take all her clothes off and lie naked on the bed.
Now, while you've been saying this, I've been looking through the reference books and found another. It's a rather more yucky version from as long ago as 1711.
You've jumped a page or two. Page 4 comes after page 3.
I beg your pudding. Got your bit of poetry, didn't we?
In the first one, the young woman fasts all through St Agnes Eve, and I quote, eating only a little stale bread and drinking parsley tea. Then she goes to bed, pausing only to remake the bed with clean sheets and pillowcases, and when finally she climbs into bed, she repeats the following verse. Agnes sweet and Agnes fair, hither, hither now repair. Bonny Agnes, let me see the lad who is to marry me. If it works, she will either see her lover in her dreams or see his image appear in her bedroom or dressing table mirror. Alternative verses include, St Agnes, be a friend to me. In the gift I ask of thee, let me this night my future husband see. Or even, St Agnes, I pray unto thee, I, a maid, would married be, so thou my husband show to me.
While you've been saying this, I've been looking through the reference books and found another, rather more yucky version from as long ago as 1711. It goes like this. Take a sprig of rosemary and another of thyme, herb obviously. Sprinkle them with urine thrice. Put one into one shoe and the other into another shoe. Then place the shoes at each side of the bed. When you go to bed, say, St Agnes, that's to lovers kind, come ease the troubles of my mind, and you'll dream of your lover. So let's hope your lover is not a cobbler, as he'd be grossed out by your shoes. Anyway, you said there were two main forms of St Agnes Eve's rituals. What's the other one?
The other one involves cake. It's called dumb cake, and apparently it was still being practiced in rural Lincolnshire and East Anglia up until the Second World War, when presumably an influx of single American airmen and troops and regular dances in airfield hangars removed the need to resort to magic to find a husband. OK, dumb cake. The earliest recorded recipes for this go back to 1685. And you make a cake, actually it sounds more like a savoury pancake, or what the Scottish would call a bannock, made of flour, salt, water and egg. And then you cook it on a griddle, and once finished you place it beneath your pillow, and then you'll dream of your future beloved. Unlike some of the other St Anne's rituals, dumb cakes will supposedly work for men and women, and you can do it collectively with, say, 4 people all taking part in the cooking process, sharing out the ingredients into equal parts, stirring them all together, and then when it's cooked, dividing it into quarters and each taking a piece to place under their own pillows. However, there is a catch, which is why it's called dumb cake, in that the whole preparation and cooking process must be carried out in absolute silence. No talking, no smiles, no laughing, and no sniggering. Otherwise the magical spell will be broken. Oh, and you'll like this. According to some versions of this ritual, once you've placed your slice of dumb cake beneath your pillow, you should walk backwards into your bed.
Perhaps if all these young maidens didn't have shoes that smelt of wee and hair full of crumbs from the cakes they'd been sleeping on, they might have had more success with the boys. Just a thought. Anyway, just to neatly round off this piece, who was St Agnes? I'm guessing she was some poor Sheila from the Roman Empire era who was horribly martyred for her beliefs. Would I be right?
You are, as ever, spot on. She was apparently a beautiful young girl, only about 12 or 13 years old, from a noble family, and had many suitors from other wealthy families. However, when she turned them down because of her, in quotes, a resolute devotion to religious purity, one of the young men sneaked on her to the authorities and called her out for being Christian. This was at a time when in the Roman Empire, when Christians were still being persecuted. According to the legend, she was sentenced to be dragged naked through the streets to a brothel. However, she prayed to heaven, whereupon her hair grew to cover her entire body, and any men who tried to molest her were immediately struck blind. The Roman authorities then reverted to Plan B, to kill her, first by trying to burn her alive at a stake, but the bundles of wood and kindling did not catch fire, so finally a Roman soldier hacked off her head. Apparently you can still see her head, well at least her skull, in a shrine at the Church of Sant'Agnese in the Piazza Navona in Rome. And today you'll be pleased to learn St Agnes is the patron saint of chastity, of girls, of engaged couples, of rape survivors, virgins, girl guides and gardeners.
Gardeners?
Yes, gardeners.
Oh. You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
One of the topics we're looking at this show is the collision of modern-day technology with the worlds of magic, folklore and the associated urban myths that can be generated. Back in the 1970s, this used to be called Xerox law or photocopy law. A decade later it became fax law, then email law, and more recently, with the main channel now becoming social media, it's now known as internet law. All of them have a common theme. Modern office technologies provide a simple way for modern myths, memes and urban legends to be spread to a wide and now global audience far quicker than was ever before possible in human history. If a story goes viral or starts trending on Twitter and Facebook, it is almost impossible to stop, which is why fake news has become such an issue. That's a subject for another day. What prompted me to look at this issue is the fact we've just had the 20th anniversary of the first outing of the Bill Gates wants to give you $5,000 online hoax. The earliest version appeared in June 1997, when an email purporting to come from Bill Gates of Microsoft, and now, by the way, the richest man on the planet, offering to pay money as part of a so-called tracked email beta test if you forwarded the email to all your contacts. The rate was $245 for each person you forward your email to, and lo and behold, tens of thousands of people who ought to know better fell for the story and proceeded to fill my and everybody else's they knew email boxes with spam, supposedly coming from Bill Gates. A couple of years later, the same story appeared again, though this time with something to do about AOL, American Online, and Intel. And this time around, Microsoft even issued an official statement saying it was a hoax, and they ought to know. Unfortunately, the people who had fallen for the original hoax believed the Microsoft denial was a hoax. I mean, the original had to be true, didn't it? Because there were equally bogus emails going around citing a non-existent article in USA Today saying it was true, and there were also emails coming from equally fictional lawyers saying they knew the law and this was a genuine offer. Only it wasn't. But this wasn't the end of the story, because another version of the Bill Gates hoax email came out around 10 years later in 2007, and it was back again last year in 2017, the latest one asking you to share a post on Facebook, and this time it was backed up by a doctored photograph of Bill Gates. Think about it. Microsoft employs about 120,000 people. If they want to test a new software feature, they surely have enough people of their own to test it. And think about the money. In the Facebook hoax, the offer had gone up from $245 to $5,000. Microsoft is big, but even they can't afford that much money. Oh yes, and Bill Gates no longer has anything to do with the day-to-day running of Microsoft. There again, when it comes to apparently get-rich-quickly schemes, most people don't think. All they see are the dollar signs, which is why people still fall for all those pyramid selling scams and those Nigerian 419 email frauds. If something sounds too good to be true, then it usually is. Just remember the rhyme. Don't let 'em coax you with a hoax. Make one keystroke. Hit delete, folks. We're now going to talk to Andy Stokes, a computer consultant I've known for many years, and, like so many people working IT, a big fan of science fiction, fantasy, and the sort of weird stuff we cover in this show. You have a lot of hands-on experience with working with people. What sort of myths do you encounter, or sort of urban legends?
Well, I mean, I think they're very similar to the ones that we come across that you just mentioned, and it's certainly surprising the way that these things do have a perpetual life, and they resurface every 3 to 5 years and do the rounds again and get 100,000 hits, and some people just fall for them again. So it was interesting, when you were talking about kind of technology myths, and that got me thinking about, how old is technology? And I suppose technology is as old as the wheel, and that got me thinking about, what myths, how far do some of these myths go back? Which is what got me thinking about the old photography stealing your soul myth, that apparently used to be prevalent when photography first started happening.
Yes. I mean, more recently, you hear people saying, if you are out in the Amazon photographing primitive tribes people, they're terrified. But the fact is, people in the West were equally concerned when it first happened.
Well, yes, and looking into it a little bit, apparently it was first to do with when people first encountered mirrors for the first time, and they saw their reflection and they moved their hand to their face, and the reflection did the same, and there was a thought of, has this mirror captured part of me or captured my soul? And then when people realised that photography was doing the same thing, capturing their image. that's when it started to be reflected about photography. Although apparently this myth about photography capturing your soul, it is in fact a bit of a myth. It wasn't that widely spread apparently amongst indigenous peoples when they first came, and apparently, in fact, some indigenous tribes, when they saw photography, they thought it was a good way to, if you like, stay in touch with their ancestors, that their ancestors could be with them forever. So the fear of it stealing souls wasn't apparently that widespread. And it's almost gone into urban legend that every tribe was fearful of this, when in fact it was one or two individuals. There we go.
And of course, all as in the, in quotes, civilized West, who were terrified of mirrors. Yes.
Yes, apparently, yes. Well, I'd imagine the first time you encounter one, it would be very strange. Obviously we're born and we grow up with them and we understand them, but if you first encounter it, I'd imagine it would be very puzzling to someone.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, how old are technology myths? So that's a fairly old one. And I suppose, if you kind of, switch it round the other way, and we're talking about, ancient beliefs and so forth, if you kind of put it through a mirror, if you like, and it's kind of if you think about it, it's very Neil Gaiman. I was watching American Gods on TV, the first series last year, and I read the book years and years ago, and it started me thinking about the old gods and the new gods, and Neil Gaiman's idea that perhaps technology nowadays and our life nowadays leads to kind of us to worship different things and behave differently. And the thought process went on, okay, well, let's imagine for a moment that if taking a photograph does steal your soul or part of your soul, well, what does that mean nowadays? Particularly since it's probably been about 15 years now since we all started getting front-facing cameras, and the selfie has become prevalent throughout society.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking that, actually, if you do have a little bit of your soul taken away when a photographic image is taken, what on earth is happening to some of these self-obsessed narcissists that we see on Facebook and Instagram and all the vloggers and YouTube? What on earth is happening to them?
Yeah.
And the thought occurred, well, perhaps these people weren't like that originally. Perhaps they were very normal people, and it's only after they started taking one or two selfies that they started to change, that they started to become narcissists and self-obsessed. And perhaps it's because perhaps a little bit of their soul is being stolen away from them and changing the way that they behave. And from there, it wasn't a huge leap to then say, is the front-facing camera going to cause the zombie apocalypse? We see people walking around, heads down, looking at their smartphones and their devices, shuffling slowly along the street, muttering to themselves, because the zeitgeist is very much that yes, there's going to be a zombie apocalypse, but we're not quite sure what's going to cause it. And yet we do have these people shuffling around, muttering to themselves, ignoring people. So is that going to cause the zombie apocalypse? I mean, even the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta published an article in 2011 called 101 Zombie Apocalypse, providing tips on preparing to survive a zombie invasion. And that was very much tongue in cheek. That was the CDC trying to get people to read up about survival tips for natural disasters. But even they're getting in on the zeitgeist of yes, there's going to be a zombie apocalypse. Apparently, we're just not sure when or how it's going to happen.
It does now crop up on the sort of 10 most likely causes of an apocalypse, along with aliens attacks and supervolcanoes and being hit by missing planets and asteroids. Zombie apocalypse is up there, which is quite amazing that It's come from
Well, it's
total fiction. I mean, zombies weren't even big in fiction till George Romero came along, and it took a long time to get the sort of, if you like, the cult following zombies now have. Obviously, with the
Night of the Living Dead.
with the TV series, it's obviously keeping it going. But for a long time, it just wasn't on the radar. People were worried about vampires and werewolves, but they weren't worried about zombies. But
That's true, and I do wonder whether, I mean, as we're all living longer nowadays, and perhaps we have a fear of loss of self, which I guess goes with being a zombie, and we're all living longer, and we all have a greater probability that perhaps we'll have a degenerative disease, and we'll lose our cognitive ability. And perhaps that's a fear that people have nowadays, and it's kind of tapping into. They're thinking, I want to be myself. I never want to lose myself, my sense of self. And perhaps that's part of the thought why it's become so prevalent in people's minds.
Yeah. No, good point. Yeah. Any other tech related myths you can think of?
Well, I wouldn't say myths, but there was certainly one misunderstanding about technology that always springs to mind. As you know, I work in technology for law firms, and I'm not going to name names, but there was one partner who was 15 years ago travelling to the middle of Africa, and he knew he wouldn't have any connectivity. Almost like being in Norfolk, I suppose. And he did ask the IT department. He said, I know I will have no telephony whatsoever, so I'd like you to load the internet onto my laptop, please. We kind of had to explain how it all worked, but yeah. Thankfully, hopefully, people do understand such things nowadays.
You sure about that?
Okay, most of them do.
Yes.
Most of them do.
Right then. Well, Andy Stokes, thank you ever so much for your time. That was brilliant. And speak to you again at another time. Cheers now.
I'm sure we will. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye now.
While we're on the subject of technology and urban myths, time now for my own personal contribution. It's what I call the case of the haunted disk drive. It was during the early 1980s when I was living and working in London and dabbling in a little computer consultancy work. It was back in the days of the early personal computers when PCs didn't have hard drives and both machine operating systems and software applications had to be booted up from floppy disks. Called floppy disks because in those days of the 5¼ inch disks they really were floppy, just a piece of plastic between cardboard. I was having lunch with the managing director of one of the UK's leading legal publishers at an Italian restaurant in Fleet Street one day. He was picking my brains while I was picking at my spaghetti. Yeah, there really is no such thing as a free lunch. It was also about this time I realised the phrase dynamic legal publisher was an oxymoron. That's another story. He happened to mention that one of his offices was having problems with a computer and would I might be able to help. The issue was that first thing on a morning the computer, and this was in the days when a small office might only have one PC and certainly no network, was not working properly for at least the first 2 hours, but then, after that time had elapsed, it would start functioning properly. But then again, the following morning, the problem repeated itself. They'd had the computer hardware tested, no issues found, ditto the software on the floppy disks. But the problem would not go away, and the mystery remained. I said I'd have a look in, and before I departed from our lunch, this would have been about 4 p.m, as this was in the days when people still had long alcohol-fueled lunches, the managing director confided in me that there was a rumour that the office, located in an old building on Carter Lane near St Paul's Cathedral, was haunted, and it had been suggested that perhaps the ghost objected to the introduction of new technology into an office that probably hadn't changed since Victorian times. A couple of days later I visited the office in the morning and found, just as I'd been advised, that the computer did take about 2 hours before it was functioning properly. It was also fair to say that some parts of the office were distinctly spooky. Now, if the computer hardware and software was working properly, that left only one obvious natural, as distinct from supernatural, variable to consider, and that was human error. So I had the staff describe their daily routine. On the face of it, it seemed perfectly normal. Nothing screamed out human error. On a morning, they'd switch on the computer, insert the floppy disks, and so on. And then on an evening, they'd remove the disks, turn off the computer. Nothing at all unusual. So we agreed that the following day, I'd be at the office first thing when they opened up, so I could observe their routine in operation for myself. And there it was. Not a ghost, but a great big steel safe that had probably been in the office since the 19th century. What the staff were doing every evening at the end of the working day was storing the floppy disks in the safe, as they knew that was a secure fireproof location. And there the disks would remain for around 16 hours until the safe was opened up again the following morning. What the staff hadn't realised, and why would they, was the difference between the room temperature of the office and the coolness of the interior of the safe meant that overnight condensation formed on the magnetic surface of the floppy disks, and it was this that was causing the computer disk drives to be unable to read them the following morning. However, after a couple of hours, the condensation naturally evaporated and the disks were back to their normal operating temperature. Mystery solved. Not a ghost, but an early sighting of what is now known among IT help desks as PEBCAC, P-E-B-K-A-C. Problem exists between keyboard and chair.
Staying with our tales of technology and urban myths, here's a story that, while only a few days old, will undoubtedly give rise to conspiracy theories people will still be debating for years to come. Shortly after 8 a.m. local time last Saturday, 13th of January, an employee at the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency settled in at the start of his shift. Among his duties that day was to initiate an internal test of the emergency missile warning system, essentially a practice of sending an emergency alert to the public without actually sending it to the public. It was a drill the agency had started with some regularity since last November, around the time Hawaii reinstated its Cold War-era nuclear warning sirens amid growing fears of an attack by North Korea. And so, while the tests were not yet routine enough to be predictable, they were not entirely new either. Around 8:05, the Hawaii emergency employee initiated the internal test. According to a timeline since released by the state authorities, from a drop-down menu on a computer program, he saw two options. Number 1, test missile alert. Number 2, missile alert. He was supposed to choose the former, but as we now know, he chose the latter and initiated a real-life missile alert. The result was around 8:07, the message went out to hundreds of Hawaii residents and tourists on their cell phones, announcing, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill." A more detailed message scrolled across television screens in Hawaii suggesting, "If you're indoors, stay indoors. If you're outdoors, seek immediate shelter in a building. Remain indoors well away from windows. If you are driving, pull safely to the other side of the road and seek shelter in a building or lay on the floor." The false warning sparked a wave of panic as thousands of people, many assuming they only had minutes to live, scrambled to seek shelter and say their final goodbyes to their loved ones. The situation was exacerbated by a 38-minute gap between the initial alert and a subsequent alert being issued to say the first warning was a mistake. In other words, yet another example of PEBKAC. Problem exists between keyboard and chair. Talking of Hawaii, I was intrigued to see that the Hawaiian Islands were actually only discovered 240 years ago, almost to the day when, on the 18th of January 1778, the English explorer Captain James Cook became the first European to discover the Hawaiian Isles when he sailed past the island of Oahu. 2 days later he landed at Waimea on the island of Kauai and named the island group the Sandwich Isles in honour of John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich, who was one of his financial backers. Yes, the islands were named after the same man who gave his name to placing a piece of meat between two slices of bread. Hawaii would have its revenge on the culinary world in 1962 when a Greek Canadian called Sam Panopoulos, living in Ontario, invented the Hawaiian pizza topping, which, coincidentally, is now the favourite pizza topping in Australia, a country that was also first discovered by Captain Cook. Well, first discovered by the first European was Captain Cook. The native aboriginals would have been there for tens of thousands of years longer.
Find us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or email us at urbanfantasist@icloud.com.
Time now to go myth busting again, though this time it's not so much an urban myth as an ancient historical maritime myth that the lost continent of Atlantis lies in the middle of the North Sea, somewhere beyond the Great Yarmouth Pleasure Beach. While there is no disputing the now sunken landmass in the middle of the North Sea, one that once connected the British Isles to continental Europe, played an invaluable role in the post-Ice Age repopulation of England, one of the more fantastic myths associated with it is that it was actually a location of the fabled lost civilization of Atlantis. The sunken land is nowadays known to archaeologists as Doggerland, and not because the population engaged in dogging, Google it, but because the current Dogger Bank underwater feature now occupies where it used to be. There are, of course, numerous locations identified as the possible site of Atlantis. These include somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere near the present-day Azores. The Black Sea, which some writers claim was the site of the deluge that gave rise to the story of the great flood of Genesis, Noah and his ark. The island of Santorini in the Mediterranean, where the eruption of the volcano Thera sometime round about 1600 to 1500 BC probably caused the collapse of the Minoan civilization. The Baltic Sea is another candidate, and even the Scilly Isles, where the legendary lost kingdom of Lyonesse that crops up in the legend of King Arthur is also cited as was possible Atlantis. But turning back to Doggerland, its claim to be the location of a lost civilization can be traced back to the middle of the 19th century, when an ancient manuscript, apparently handwritten in the old Frisian language, was submitted for publication. It was subsequently translated and published in both Dutch and English in the early 1870s and immediately became the subject of heated controversy. Called the Oera Linda Book, or that Oera Linda Bock in Frisian, it purported to be a chronicle of historical, mythological and religious themes from about 2000 years BC to AD 1256. It began with an account of the island of Atland or Atland, which is translated as the old land or the home country, which was located in the North Sea, being lost beneath the sea in a cataclysm in the year 2194 BC. This, the authors claimed, was the same date as Noah's flood in the Bible. Its people then settled on the Frisian coast of the Netherlands and Denmark, where they worshipped the goddess Freya. In fact, Frisians take their name from the fact they worshipped the goddess Freya. And they were ruled by a matriarchy of kindly folk mothers until their beliefs were crushed by cruel Christian missionaries. The book went on to claim the people of Atland and later Frisia developed a major maritime culture, founding the city of Tyre in the Lebanon and establishing even the Inca Empire in South America. And It was also claimed the Frisian civilization possessed an alphabet that was the ancestor of the Greek and Phoenician alphabets. Soon after its publication, however, there were claims it was a fake, a forgery and a hoax, and by 1880 it was widely discredited among academics and not taken seriously. It was then forgotten for over 50 years until it was rediscovered by a Volkisch, the nearest English equivalent would be ethno-nationalistic folklore, a Volkisch philologist called Hermann Wirth, who in 1933 published a German translation which he described as being the Nordic Bible. The book was popular with the infamous Nazi Heinrich Himmler, who was obsessed with Aryan mysticism, and soon the book became associated with Nazi occultism. However, at a conference at the University of Berlin in 1934, the book was once more condemned as a hoax and a forgery, and once more fell into obscurity for another 45 years until it was taken up by Robert Scruton in this country in his books The Other Atlantis and The Secrets of Lost Atlant. Since then, the Oerlinde book, at least in England, has become associated with earth mysteries, alternative histories and other New Age beliefs, including, most recently, neo-paganism and witchcraft. But is it a hoax? Is it a historical forgery? The answer is yes. In fact, the historical evidence is stacked against Doggerland having ever been home to an advanced civilization. Archaeological findings, including animal remains, human remains, work flints and harpoons crafted from antlers, have been dredged from the Doggerland site between East Anglia and the Dutch coast over the last 50 years, but they are only consistent with a hunter-gatherer culture of the Mesolithic Neolithic period. That's about 12,000 years ago, or 10,000 BC. And, as archaeological evidence also indicates, Doggerland vanished sometime around the year 5000 BC. That's still some 3,000 years earlier than the date given in the Oerlinde book. The book also contains a number of anachronisms and inaccuracies. We now know, for example, that the Inca Empire was not founded in ancient times but relatively recently, and which suggests a mid-19th century rather than 13th century or earlier authorship. Plus, the fact that even the Nazis rejected the book as a fraud should be damning enough. After all, the Nazis had plenty of their own batshit crazy crackpot beliefs about Nordic supermen living within a hollow earth, accessed by flying saucers, going in and out of secret tunnels at the North and South Poles, if they thought it was a hoax. So who actually wrote it and why? The professor of Frisian language and literature, Goff Jensma, wrote in 2004 that the most likely candidates were a trio of 19th century writers: Cornelius Over de Linden, who's the man who originally found the manuscript and submitted it for publication, Eelco Verwisch, and Pastor Francois Haverschmidt. And according to Jensma, when they wrote their book, they intended it to be, and I quote, a temporary hoax to fool some nationalist Frisians and Orthodox Christians, and as an exercise in reading the Holy Bible in a non-fundamentalist symbolical way, whatever that means. Although, as Jensma also added, it is a perfect irony that a book written to unmask the Holy Bible as a book of human making has itself become a gospel, which sadly is a trait of too many urban legends, such as the Highgate vampire myth we looked at a couple of shows ago, where the distinction between myth and storytelling and fiction becomes blurred with reality. One of the things we've been looking at in this show is the way modern technology is helping to create a whole new generation of urban myths, and how one of the more intriguing ones is celebrity death hoax, where a story can suddenly appear on the internet saying Celebrity X has just died, and then 5 minutes later Facebook and Twitter is packed with little sad face emojis and people saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe he or she is really dead," which of course they aren't.
Yes, I mean, Eddie Murphy, who I think the last time I saw him in a movie was Beverly Hills Cop. in 1980s, wasn't it? He's been the victim of a death hoax on 6 separate occasions. Then there's John Bon Jovi, who supposedly died in 2011, but didn't. And he posted a picture online with him holding a sign saying, "Heaven looks a lot like New Jersey."
Although some cynics suggested this was proof he actually was dead, because hell looks a lot like New Jersey. And have you heard about the falling off a mountain thing?
No, what's that?
Well, although the death hoax usually involves the victim dying in a car crash or of a drug overdose...
Which a lot of them do die of.
Yeah, but there's been a spate of them apparently dying as a result of falling off a mountain. The country and western singer Reba McEntire was reported to have fallen off a mountain in Austria to her death in 2012. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, currently starring in the Jumanji remake, apparently fell off a mountain in New Zealand and died in 2011, as did the actor Jeff Goldblum. And in 2010, it was the turn of Russell Crowe to fall to his death from a mountain, also this time in Austria. He subsequently commented on Twitter, "Unable to answer the tweets, fell off a mountain in Austria, all over Red Rover, don't know how I got there, but the media are never wrong. Goodbye."
Remind me to never go on a mountaineering holiday in either Austria or New Zealand. Or maybe we should go, because if you do fall off a mountain, you don't die. And I also see Paul McCartney was the subject of an online death hoax in 2012, although not involving any mountains. And of course, in those crazy pre-internet days, Paul was the centre of a huge Paul's dead rumour in 1969 when the Beatles released their Abbey Road album. Do you think we need to remind readers who the Beatles were and that Paul was in the band?
Probably, but they can Google it. Anyway, the rumour does need some explanation. Along with the usual story that if you played the vinyl album backwards on a turntable, you'd hear the band sing "Paul is Dead," which I've never quite worked how you do play an album backwards. The theory, which started in the US, is that the album cover depicts the Beatles walking out of a cemetery in a funeral procession. John Lennon in front, in white, is the priest. He's followed by Ringo Starr, who's all in black. He's the undertaker. And at the very end of the group is George Harrison. He's in denim and he's the gravedigger. As for Paul, who's walking between Starr and Harrison, because he is out of step with everyone else and barefoot, he is the dead body.
But if he was dead, how did he get into the picture?
Because he was a body double. And he was clearly indicating he was an imposter because he's holding a cigarette in his right hand, whereas the real Paul was left-handed.
And clearly no left-handed person could ever hold a cigarette in their right hand.
Exactly, my dear Watson. And further proof is that the white Volkswagen Beetle in the background has the number plate LMW 281F.
And the final figures 281F mean McCartney would have been 28 if he'd lived. But they do realise the number 1 and the letter I are not the same.
Yeah, it's a sort of visual gag that doesn't really work. Anyway, the BW Beetle is now in a museum in Germany. There's been a webcam filming the Abbey Road zebra crossing since 2011. So if you go online, you can see whoever's crossing the famous zebra crossing there. The crossing itself now has Grade 2 listed status for cultural and historical importance. Ringo Starr received a knighthood in the 2018 Year's Honours List just a couple of weeks ago. And Sir Paul McCartney, like Tiny Tim, did not die, but is alive and well and still making music at the age of 75. Also, if you want to have your photograph taken there, the nearest tube station to Abbey Road is St John's Wood, which is on the Jubilee line, and the station is about a 5-minute walk away.
Thank you, tourist office man.
Thank you. I do take tips. Here's an anniversary we didn't have time for in our last show, and it's not one for animal lovers, so you might want to take the opportunity to leave the room, put the kettle on, make a cup of tea, make a cup of coffee. Anyway, on the 4th of January 1903, Topsy, a 30-year-old female Asian elephant, was executed at Luna Park, which was part of New York's Coney Island amusement park complex. And yes, I did say executed.
Topsy had apparently gained a reputation for being a, in quotes, bad elephant, and after killing a spectator in 1902, was involved in several well-publicised incidents attributed variously to the actions of either her drunken handler or Luna Park's new publicity-hungry owners, Frederick Thompson and Elmer Dundee. Their end-of-year plan was to hang Topsy at the park in a public spectacle and charge admission. However, they were stopped by the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals on the grounds that it would be needlessly cruel, which I think is putting it rather mildly. The event was then cut back to invited guests and press only, and Thompson, Dundee and Dundee agreed to use a more sure method of killing the elephant, involving strangling her with large ropes tied to a steam-powered winch, also using poison, and finally electrocution. So, on January the 4th, in front of a small crowd of invited reporters and guests, Topsy was fed poison, electrocuted and strangled, the electrocution ultimately killing her. Among the press that day was a crew from the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company who filmed the event. Their film of the electrocution was then released to be viewed in coin-operated kinetoscopes under the title Electrocuting an Elephant. Yes, this is what people had for entertainment before television and Netflix. The electricians attached copper-lined sandals connecting to AC lines to Topsy's right forefoot and left hindfoot, so the charge would flow through her body. She was then fed carrots laced with potassium cyanide before 6,600 volts were flashed through her for 10 seconds. This toppled her to the ground, and according to contemporary accounts, she died without a trumpet or a groan. By way of context, it is worth noting that a number of American states had only relatively recently adopted the electric chair as a method of executing criminals, so the public did have a morbid fascination with electrocution. However, it is an urban myth that Topsy's execution was masterminded by Thomas Edison as part of the War of the Currents. This was when the early US electricity companies were still clashing over the rival standards of direct current, or DC, which was backed by Edison's General Electric, versus alternating currents, or AC, backed by Westinghouse. Edison criticised the AC method as being lethally dangerous. However, the so-called War of the Currents was over some 10 years before Topsy's sad death, with AC emerging the winner and General Electric being merged with their arch-rivals Westinghouse. If it is any consolation, the film bombed at the box office and on kinetoscopes and vanished into the obscurity it deserved for the next 70 years.
So now we're into the season of colds and flu bugs. Do your magic books have anything to say about remedies for flu and the common cold?
They've plenty to say, but it all comes down to the common sense remedies we already know about. Soothing chicken soup, vitamin C, eucalyptus-based inhaling, plenty of rest, keeping warm. The most intriguing I've seen is for a hot toddy, comprising the juice of 1/2 of a lemon squeezed into a mug, followed by a tablespoon of honey, 1/2 teaspoon of grated raw ginger, and a jigger, which I think is about 1½ fluid ounces, of whiskey. Then you fill the mug up with near boiling water and stir it in a clockwise direction. This would be called in a deosil direction, while chanting this little rhyme. Lemons full of vitamin C, heat of ginger, honey, bees, whiskey soulful, rich and warm, keep my body safe from harm. How about you? What have you found?
Well, I've found a very weird folk remedy, and you won't catch me volunteering for it in a hurry. Apparently you take a hot bath, then you take a pair of cotton socks, soak them in ice cold water, wring them out, and put them on your feet. And then you find a pair of dry wool socks and put them over the wet socks and go to bed for the night. Now, supposedly, it kickstarts your immune system by increasing blood flow. Your feet need to get warm, so your body responds. It's also supposed to relieve congestion and help you sleep.
Yes, because nothing helps you sleep more comfortably than cold, wet feet.
Bonkers, basically.
Almost time to go, but before we do, one final example of modern day technology colliding with the worlds of magic and spells. Apparently the 28th of January this year is Data Protection or Data Privacy Day. I know, who knew? Anyway, I came across this ritual. First of all, you do all you humanly can to ensure your computer system is secure and any personal data, login details and passwords are safe. Then you call upon the Archangel Metatron and ask him to lock up your daughter. I keep saying daughter, I should say data. You ask the Archangel Metatron to lock up your data. Now, Metatron, not an archangel I confess I'm that familiar with, but he does crop up in the Talmud and some mystical Kabbalistic text where he is described as God's recording angel. So that also makes him the archangel for maths and words, which is about as close as we're going to get to computer coding. Anyway, having called upon the Archangel Metatron, then you call upon the Archangel Michael. No underpant jokes, please, which is a reference that may be lost on listeners unfamiliar with the Marks & Spencer brand. And you ask Michael to place a fiery wall of protection around your system. Now that really is a firewall I'd like to see. And finally, you change your desktop photo or wallpaper to display the Algiz rune. That's the rune that looks like an upside down peace sign. Obviously calling upon the protection from Kabbalistic, Christian and neo-pagan traditions should ensure that your data is protected. But even this won't help you if your password is still password or 123456. Janie and I look forward to your company when we return in a fortnight with more weird tales from the world of ghosts, folklore, urban myths, witchcraft and magic.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com,